At 16, Eva meets Jamie by chance. She lives in middle class South Brooklyn. He comes from the super rich of Upper Manhattan. She's observant, cautious, often insecure. He's curious, bold, full of mysteries. These two questers are drawn together in a strange and profound friendship tested by forces larger than themselves. As Eva follows a path of conventional achievement, a prestigious degree, a classic romance, the start of an ambitious career, Jamie seeks out more radical experiments in finding himself, renouncing his family, joining a political movement, and eventually even talking to God. Carried forcefully along by Clare Sestanovich's exquisite prose, these two characters are pulled into separate spheres, but circle the same questions: how to define their values and find their purpose, how to create a sense of self while discovering what they owe society, and to the cause of justice. These reckonings propel a surprising story of intimacy across time, exploring the alchemy of identity, the mystery of destiny, and the difficult journey of finding faith in yourself and in the world. Clare Sestanovich, named a 5 under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation in 2022, is the author of the story collection Objects on Fire, a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Her fiction has appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and Harper's Magazine. She lives in Brooklyn. Sestanovich will be in conversation with Hilary Kelly. Kelly is a critic and essayist living in Washington, D.C. Her work appears in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, New York Magazine, and Vogue. That's enough of my voice now. Please join me in welcoming these two wonderful writers.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Hello, am I on? Okay. Before we started to talk, the two of us, I think Claire wanted to read a little bit from the beginning of Ask Me Again.
Yeah, I will start on page 1. In a courtyard behind the hospital, with cold metal benches and leafless trees strangled by Christmas lights, Eva came upon a doctor smoking a cigarette. He sucked on it hungrily. He exhaled out of the side of his mouth and glared at her, defiant, adolescent, as if daring her to point out his hypocrisy. She was the actual adolescent, 16 years old. She could have told him that she enjoyed hypocrisy. No, not in herself. Her own contradictions made her seem strange and ugly, like dressing room mirrors that revealed angles of her face she couldn't usually see. But in other people, inconsistency was interesting, a mark of complexity, maybe maturity. She smiled at the doctor. He crushed the cigarette under his shoe, an elegant pivot with an inelegant sneaker, and went back inside. You weren't supposed to like hospitals, but secretly Eva did. She liked being close to so many extremes. Birth, death. It was surely the cleanest place she had ever been. Surgeons, she learned, scrubbed their hands for 2 to 6 minutes, all the way up to their elbows, and also the dirtiest. Blood, shit, infectious disease. She timed 6 minutes. It was a long time. People yelled in hospitals and people whispered. They limped or they hobbled or they sprinted from one emergency to the next. She had watched a man fall asleep standing up. There was good news and bad news. Miracles happened, but sometimes, a lot of the time, life simply dealt you a bad hand. Whenever she heard an ambulance approaching, Eva went toward it, not away from it. She stood right next to the automatic doors of the emergency room, longing to cover her ears and willing herself not to. It would have been easy to block the sirens out, but she had recently adopted a new ethic, too new to be violating already. Block nothing out. If she listened long enough, close enough, the wailing of the trucks became an urgent pulse inside her body. While her grandmother slept in a semi-private room, a pale green curtain separating her from a carpenter who'd fallen off a ladder and broken his back, Eva wandered the halls in search of characters. In the basement, radiology, she found a woman in a plastic chair, clutching a jagged chunk of rose quartz in each hand. On a floor with a view all the way across Central Park, cardiology, she found a man singing union songs while wheeling an IV up and down the hall. "Which side are you on?" he belted, then hummed, then belted again. "Yours," a doctor rushing past assured him. Through an open door in the pediatric wing, she found a toddler wearing a styrofoam helmet, smiling placidly as grim headlines scrolled across the television in front of him. Then there were patients like Eva's grandmother Adele, who seemed too empty to be characters. Vacant stares in the waiting rooms, haggard faces in the cafeteria. The elevators were packed with people who didn't want to look at you. But of course they had stories too, all the more alluring for seeming blank or being hidden. She brought these characters, these puzzles, back to her parents. She meant it as a kind of comfort, someone else's story to distract from their own. Adele wasn't unconscious, but she wasn't exactly awake either, and no one would say when or if she might be. The doctors, with their unreadable expressions and their unknowable expertise, with sentences so complex they might as well have been secrets, blandly instructed them to wait, cryptically promised they would see. Eva's parents paced, grimaced. They clenched their hands and jaws without noticing they were clenching. Her dad had his sketchbook, the rhythmic sound of pencil against paper, like an animal scratching plaintively at the door. Her mom kept buying things from the vending machine at the end of the hall, packages that had been there for too long, crackers crumbled to dust, chocolate white with age. She opened them and then abandoned them, forming a pile on an empty chair, as if stockpiling for some future disaster. Adele was in the hospital because she'd jumped out the window at her nursing home. It was a second-floor window. She hadn't died as she'd hoped she would. Her bones broke in lots of different ways. Her right kneecap into many pieces, her lowest rib neatly in two. Her pelvis had somehow remained intact, spider-veined with cracks like the surface of a melting lake, but her ulna had pierced straight through the skin of her forearm. By the time Eva and her parents arrived at the hospital, it had been pushed or pulled back into place, reset. For nearly her entire life, from Krakow to Boston to the assisted living facility in New Jersey, the village they called it, Adele had been a devout Catholic. She gave God credit for everything, beseeching him desperately, thanking him profusely. She had never insisted on anyone else's devotion. Eva's father hadn't been to Mass in decades. Eva's mother could be haughty in her non-belief. But their ingratitude had worried her and brought her pain. Then, a few months before she jumped, all that changed. With a suddenness that seemed biblical, her piety had turned into rage. Why had everything been taken from her? Her husband, her driver's license, her bladder control, one friend after another. And then the house. She'd given her life to that house. She'd given other people lives in that house. 3 children, 6 grandchildren. She raged instead of eating, raged instead of sleeping, raged into the phone long after she'd accidentally hung up. The doctors had explanations for the anger, tangles in the brain, something called plaque. The explanations made her angrier. She was not one of those old people. She was not confused, she was furious. She left a note beside a dish of spearmint lozenges before she jumped, dated in wobbly handwriting no longer recognizable as her own. In the note, Adele's anger was not personal or petty. That might have made things simpler. That kind of rage might have been easier to refute, or at least to ignore. She didn't call her children traitors or cowards, which made them realize that's what they were. It was the world, she said, that had disillusioned her, God who had betrayed her, and not just her. She could have tolerated that. Who was she, after all, to be spared grief and humiliation and incontinence? But what about the others, the young, the beautiful, the not yet disabused? What would happen to them?
Thank you. So first of all, I'm really happy to be here because a couple years ago, right before Objects of Desire, Clare's book came out, I was really excited because I felt like I'd found someone, found someone right at the beginning of their career, right when they were about to take off, and I got this galley copy maybe like 4 months in advance, and I was super excited that there was this wonderful writer, and nobody really knew about her yet, like it was going to be a secret. And so I was really excited when this novel made its way to my door, and it's proven that beyond just the short story that Clare can do a lot. But I'm curious, sometimes we come to these book events and people haven't read the book yet, and they've read the jacket copy, and jacket copy can be sometimes misleading, sometimes vague on purpose. So I was curious if you wanted to just give your little 2-minute spiel about what you think this book is about.
Yeah, this is why they don't let the authors write the jacket copy. The 2-minute spiel, it doesn't exist.
Apologies to the publicity team.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, I think about this book as being interested in magnetism, in the mysterious forces that draw us to people, to causes, to sort of ambitions and destinations that maybe we're aware of or maybe only become legible once we look around and find ourselves there. And at the center of the novel is this friendship featuring these two characters that are indeed on the jacket copy. And it's a weird friendship. It's not a friendship that makes obvious sense necessarily. And in that sense, the friendship becomes a character in the book, and whatever mysterious force is binding them together is sort of what I'm trying to look at, and trying to look at then in various different relationships that follow these characters over the course of the book. So in some ways, it's a book about like the different ways that you can be in people's thrall. As you found out in these pages, the book starts when they're 16, but it ends when they're in their mid-20s. And that was another thing that I think felt really important or just compelling to me when I was writing, was trying to watch how that intimacy and the mystery of the intimacy changes over time. And adolescence, as it seems like everyone here probably knows, has been through it, is turbulent and weird in that way, right? Like the 25-year-old may feel completely alienated from the 16-year-old self. So trying to track those changes through a relationship that doesn't exactly weather the changes that well, but does really map and record the changes, was really interesting to me. So there's that friendship, and then there's lots of auxiliary romances and role models and other forms of sort of obsessive fascination that can't quite be explained.
It seems like a lot of novels about friendship either want to go in one of two directions. They either want to go in, these people are absolutely meant to be best friends and everything about them is sort of like in perfect harmony, or these people are headed for a disaster. And you've written this really wonderfully ambiguous friendship, and it feels a lot more like a lot of the friendships that I know I've had, where you feel really close to someone, and then for reasons you can't quite understand, you realize that there's sort of a whole other person than you ever thought that they were. And I'm curious if that friendship was sort of the germ of the novel, or if something else came first, if it was like, you wanted to write this one character and the friendship came later, or if friendship was always at the heart of things.
Yeah, there have been so many versions that it's a little bit hard to know. But so Jane, actually, I think this helpfully answers the question for myself. We'll see if you guys agree. But so Jamie, who's like the enigma, was the first character. And in some ways that I'm realizing only now, I think it became a book about friendship and about his best friend, in part because I found him really hard to figure out and to get to know. And so I wanted to make that drama of not quite knowing. I don't know. There are a lot of writers who describe characters like walking into their head fully formed and they're just having this ongoing conversation. It doesn't really work that way for me. It feels more like getting to know somebody in real life, which is a sort of halting, haphazard, not always complete process. And so I wanted to show that process. So I think that's when it became about friendship. And Jamie is somebody who has a kind of principled commitment to opacity. Like he thinks that intimacy shouldn't be predicated on having to know everything about somebody, and that you can have secrets and you can, be single, autonomous people and also really bound together, which sounds a little bit heady and weird, and he's heady and weird, so go with it, I guess. But I think the larger question and one that kind of explains why friendship, though other types of romance as well, are at the heart of the book is like how much do you need to know about somebody to feel that you know them? What is the actual substance of knowing people? Because I think some people have the friend where it's like, oh yeah, we are so close because I know your mom's middle name and I was there when we were 6 and that crazy thing happened at the swimming pool. And then other people, it's you've been through something together, or it's just you're on a similar wavelength. I think so much of it is ineffable. So
yeah. One of the big themes in not just in this novel but in your work overall is like the confusion of youth. And sort of how, like when you think about it, it's kind of funny that every moment that you're walking around is the oldest you've ever been, right? And it's the moment when you know more than you've ever known before. And there's a moment when you get a little bit older, and I don't know when it is, and it changes for everybody, when you realize that, when you're like, oh, that was ridiculous. Like I was 12 and I really thought, like I knew a lot and I had a lot of things figured out. But I'm curious what makes you come back to this topic, to this idea of sort of how crazy it is to just be young and be out in the world and be expected to figure things out. And
yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking now about whether these two characters in their youth are know-it-alls, which I think is a category maybe I fell into, or lots of people I knew fell into it. It's sort of, maybe it's a related category, which is they are obsessed with knowledge and trying to figure stuff out. I mean, when I said they're sort of weird friends, part of it, like they don't really have shared interest, but interest itself is a shared interest. They're really curious people. They're very, they just want to know stuff and they want to ask big questions that in probably 5 years they'd be really embarrassed to ask. And I think maybe that's something that's distinctive about this time in life, is I think there are people who have that insatiable feeling toward knowledge for their whole life, but there's a sort of short window where you feel totally permitted to pursue it, or it also seems totally possible that you will get all the answers. So that blank slate-ish feeling, I think was part of why it felt necessary to start with them as teenagers. And I think, they're sort of their old souls, which I think is maybe related to your point of, I think they have a hunch that they don't know everything, but they're also really anticipating the moment when they will, and it seems like it's just around the corner or something.
It seems like most of life feels that way.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the day you're going to get everything done, or the day when your job will finally start making sense, or the day when
you'll be enlightened,
will be, and then you'll be there. And it turns out that that's actually never going to happen, which is what's great about fiction. I'm curious. I identified a lot with Eva because she's somebody who thinks that she can follow the system and do everything right. And like, I know I felt that way, like, oh, well, you're supposed to do this, and then you're supposed to go here, and then magically things are going to work. And she kind of discovers that it doesn't really work that way, that there's no like perfect code to becoming an adult. And I'm curious if you identified with her at all, and if so, if it's like a detriment to write about somebody who you identify with, or a benefit.
Yeah, as I think these early pages give a flavor of, Eva's a very sort of writerly or readerly character. She's very observant. She's attuned to stories. She's thinking a lot about the story that she's within at the same time that she's collecting other people's story. And so in that sense, I certainly identify with her as a writer and a reader. But I also wanted to... I guess I expected that readers would feel that identification, and I also wanted it to ultimately feel like it indicted them a little bit, because she becomes a quite frustrating character at times, and she the insistence on being an observer and on trying to absorb all the information around her also produces a real sense of doubt and paralysis, and what you're describing about wanting to do everything right, like. We know that type, and it's annoying. And so I did want to. I hope that readers will feel both a sense of identification and alienation from her, or maybe not alienation, but some sense of frustration that I hope becomes a kind of productive force of friction in the story.
Yeah. I hope this isn't a spoiler in any way, but I kept thinking as we were reading that we would flip to Jamie's point of view, and spoiler alert, we don't. Like this is Eva's. We're much closer to Eva than we are to Jamie, and what I really appreciated about that is that it really makes you feel how she feels. Like he's just sort of off on these like weird adventures, and he's sort of like this enigma sort of wandering around, and she doesn't know where he is, and we don't quite know where he is. And I'm curious if you were ever tempted to let the readers get closer to Jamie on their own and sort of give them maybe knowledge that she didn't have, or...
Yeah, I think it would be a really different book. Yeah. It may be a good one. There have been parts in the long path of writing this novel that I wrote that were much closer to Jamie, although a different version of Jamie, so a little bit hard to say. But I think the ultimate answer is no, because, like, to take one sort of concrete example of this, we know a lot about Eva's family, and we know very little about Jamie's family other than the fact that he's alienated from it. And I bring that up because in some ways, the most accurate and comprehensive approach to characterization is to provide context, right? Like you want to see people in their element. We've probably all had the experience of you meet somebody's parent and you think like, oh, now it's all the pieces are falling into place.
This makes sense.
And I wanted to withhold that because I didn't quite want things to click, or I didn't want us as readers or even me as a writer to be able to fall back on the sort of easy causal narratives that arise out of that kind of characterization. So yeah, Eva's muddling through and we're muddling through. I guess because in large part, I think there are many cases in real life where you get the context and you're still not getting the full story. So I wanted to dig into that.
Yeah. So as they grow older, one thing that I really enjoyed about the way that this narrative works is, we're following along with Eva, and she's getting a glimpse of what Jamie's doing, either through like they meet up or they exchange phone calls or letters, or he ends up living with her family for a while, and so she sort of is getting the news about him from their parents, which seems like such a wild situation that you would leave the family home and then your best friend would move in and like get your parents. Like I was thinking about that and I was like, that's got to be like a strange alienating feeling for you that someone else has your parents. But anyway, they end up, Jamie especially ends up joining all of these groups that all sort of purport to be egalitarian. Like he joins something that seems a lot like Occupy Wall Street, although it's not named. He joins like this storefront church, and some of it seems like it hinges on cultishness, but it's not a full-blown, cult the way that we imagine it from a movie. And I'm curious if you saw the way that Jamie ends up sort of going around and joining all of these different groups, if you saw that as like a symptom of youth, or if you saw it as something bigger than that. Because it's easy to think like, oh, when you're 21, you get swept up in something that seems great, but it seems like it's more than that. It's not just that he's like young and impressionable and,
Yeah, I mean, he's a sort of prototypical seeker, and I guess we sort of, we do think there's a developmentally appropriate time for seeking, and then you're supposed to have just sought, or I think that he is, I've said the characters don't walk into my head, so I don't know like where he ended up. But I guess I imagine that this particular fixation maybe on belonging is related to a certain period in life, but that the interest in asking these big questions and trying on different versions of the answers is something that will persist for him, or is something deeper in his personality. I mean, I think there's a way to kind of write Jamie and his experiments off as, he's just flitting from one thing to the next. But I actually think there's a real sort of negative capability in him of, you can also see his ability to try on all these different belief systems as a real sort of openness and equanimity with the idea that there isn't a singular truth. And if anything, like, I think I imagine him moving more toward that sort of state of acceptance of, yeah, I'm still really interested in all these questions, but I know we're never, going to have arrived or figured it all out.
There's a point in the novel where Eva ends up in a friendship with a character who strongly resembles a particular congresswoman who's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's not her, but the phenomenon of who she is. She's also from New York. There's a few things that sort of match up there. I'm curious, like, what was alluring about a character like that in a novel like this, where, like, because she seemed so close to AOC, you could understand her charisma right away. Like, you were like, oh, I get it. Like, I can see why somebody would want to end up friends with AOC. Like, she seems cool. She seems like all the things that you would want. She's charismatic. She's young. And I'm curious, like, about in putting someone like that in this novel, and like what was alluring about that.
Yeah. I think having a figure who feels really larger than life, both to the character in the book and to readers, gets at something that feels in a lot of the different relationships in the book important, which is like there are people and then there are ideas of people, and they're related in these really complicated ways that cause a lot of problems in our life. So to take a different example, another significant character in Eva's life is her college boyfriend, who is also an aspiring politician, and he sort of overlaps with this other politician character in various ways. And both of them, in a more straightforward way that I think readers will recognize, like Eva, this is the type of romance about which you say, like, you don't really like the guy, you like the idea of him, And that, I think, is something that for all the different characters, it's very legible, for example, in certain types of romance, or when you become really obsessed with a celebrity, like we see that that's what's going on. But it's also going on in so many other more mundane relationships. You don't need to be worshiping a celebrity to be engaged in projection and lose sight of what the real person in front of you is. So I think having such an extreme example, and one that readers would so readily recognize, was a way to, map this phenomenon at various places along a spectrum, if that makes sense. Right.
I'm curious, this is adjacent to the novel, but not a novel question. And I'm curious if you have a mentor, like an official mentor in some capacity, like somebody who would say, "Why, yes,
no,
I'm Claire's mentor."
Yeah. That sounds great.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you got one.
I don't. I have feelings about mentors, though.
Yeah.
Should I carry on asking you more about this? So you're not just left to explain why no one's mentoring you?
Why no one's mentoring me? Well, I think it's really hard. I think most people don't, right?
Yeah, no, right? Does anybody here have like a perfect No? Okay.
So, but it's in, I think the quest, Eva and Jamie are two people who would love a mentor,
right? Which is why I'm asking. They're both like desperate for somebody.
And Jamie may be more readily willing to accept some mentors or something, or he's got a lot of, maybe he has a lower bar, so he acquires a lot of them.
Yeah.
Eva, too high a bar. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's certainly another type of kind of platonic romance that is thrown into this book, and Jess, the political character, is definitely
part of the reason I'm asking is I think when you're A, young, B, a woman, and C, a writer, this like little Venn diagram, people love to give you the advice that you should find a mentor, and it's they make it sound like there are just like lines of mentors outside of
they're
bookstores,
rarely offering
like
to be
waiting
one.
for you to like shepherd you into this better place. And I've personally found that, the line is definitely not there. And also that like that has to be an organic relationship. And if it's like you don't write someone an email just saying like, would you like to be my mentor? And the reason that I'm so like curious about this is because it feels like it would be such an easy route, and it seems like something that Eva is like so desperate to have. She keeps like seeking out these people who she thinks have it slightly better than her, or know more, or like can usher her into something better, and it just doesn't quite work out that way. And I was curious, like, if you believed in that model at all, of like that there's somebody up there like willing to put a hand down and sort of like pull you up.
Yeah, well, Jess is an interesting example here, and I don't think this will really involve any spoilers, but I think she's somebody where Eva really thinks like, oh, maybe this is my mentor. And I don't think Jess thinks that at all.
Right.
And I think that's often the case, and it's maybe really not necessary to have these purely reciprocal relationships that are identically defined on both sides of the dynamic. And that's maybe another common denominator of a lot of the relationships in the book, is there are asymmetries, and I think we're really primed to think of asymmetries as being fatal flaws, and anything that doesn't have, perfect balance is doomed. And, if the mentor doesn't know that she's mentoring, then we've got a problem. Like, we would have to sit down and process that and figure out where things went awry. And it actually just maybe isn't really a problem. Right. Or, it doesn't check the box of, I found this person that I perfectly click with. But Eva's still learning plenty from Jess. And in fact, I think the instability or, the imperfect congruity of those relationships also contains real wisdom that maybe Eva's not appreciating in the moment, but I have a feeling she will.
Right.
So maybe this is just the way you rationalize how, like, it's better not to have a mentor when you didn't have a mentor, but I kind of think there's something to it.
Another idea that pops up in the novel is advice columns and sort of the proffering of advice. And I have a love-hate relationship with advice columns. I don't know about you, but I tend to read them, and maybe I'm not the only one here, but I tend to read them and think, like, how could you possibly answer that? You need way more information. Like, I want 50 pages from the person explaining, like, how they know that about their cousin and where they got the information from, and like why they're that mad. And like, I feel like, how can you possibly give an answer, a public answer to this person? Yeah. I read the ethicist like devotedly just to argue with the ethicist, who certainly knows a lot more about ethics than I do, but I'm like, and I'm curious first of all, how you feel about advice columns.
Love to read them.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I was a child reading Dear Abby, so which was in the comic section. Don't know why.
Did you feel like you kind of give Eva this woman who almost could be the perfect mentor, because her whole job is to give other people advice? And I'm curious, like, if you think of that as, if you think of giving advice that way as like a valid system. I always think of like, those Instagram therapists. They're like Dr. Whoever. It's like the kids one is Dr. Becky, but there's a lot of other ones, and they're like, here's how you solve this problem. And you're like, you don't know my kid. Like, my kid would keep smacking you like that, But like, that's how advice works, right? It's always general. It's never going to be perfect. It's not really going to solve your problem, because you have to solve the problem after that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and maybe it's related a little bit to my evasive answer about how there's a certain type of characterization that's more interesting without the context. I think there's a reason people are writing to advice columnists. Well, there are many reasons. I couldn't give you all of them, but like, if you wanted to give the 50-page version of your problem, you'd call up your best friend. Like, sometimes what you want is somebody who's going to give you the not fully informed but decisive answer. Once you start writing a novel, the answers will elude you because there's simply too much complexity. So I think for a certain type of clarity. You want a certain simplicity that comes from the person who doesn't really know you, you know? I'm going to lay it out and I'm going to there will be key omissions, and that's in fact precisely the point. Right. So, you know, that's also the pleasure of reading them, is that you get to fill in all those blanks yourself.
Do you ever feel like being a novelist or a fiction writer of any kind is like being either an advice columnist or a person writing to an advice columnist?
Right. It's sort of the opposite. It's I'm going to fill in all the stuff that neither person is quite going to say. I mean, I think if you were a novelist who conceives of yourself as an advice columnist, you have a problem because you're going to be really didactic. Right. But, you know, I'm sure every novelist would love to receive advice-seeking letters, because we're just, you know, prurient people who want to know everyone else's stories. So
thinking about wide, open, vague questions, each of the chapters in the book has a very vague sounding question title, and I sort of like was playing a little game with myself reading them and wondering about them. And so there are things like, why is that? Like, that's the title. Why is that? Or what do you mean? And they're these super vague questions. And I'm curious about, usually or frequently throughout history, the like an epigraph at the beginning of a novel or at the beginning of a chapter is meant to like give the reader more information. Yeah. It's meant to be like, it's a quote from like a Rumi quote, or, you know, something where you're supposed to sort of embody that as you keep going. And as you enter each of these chapters, the questions are like, why are we here and what's happening? You know, they're all these like giant questions. And I'm curious about that choice.
Yeah. It was a very intuitive choice, which is not something that happens to me that often when writing. I'm a very sort of doubtful second guesser sort of writer. So I had these questions and I wanted them to feel like the, you know, framing, but as you say, also destabilizing questions. And so I kind of just went with it in a way that felt, I think, in keeping with the spirit of the book and the way that these characters approach these very vague, open-ended questions in a kind of both fearless and fearful way. The questions are, you know, they're vague. They're questions that can be read very mundanely and very profoundly, depending on, you know, your mood or the context. And I think that did feel important to me of, you know, Eva and Jamie are both people who I think are seeking a seamless integration of the mundane and the profound, which, another spoiler alert, they're not going to get. But I think that's sort of part of the appeal of a lot of these open-ended questions is the way they, you know, might purport to bring some elusive unity to life and all the things that we're curious about in life.
So I think my last question is going to be the kind that's like a compliment for you, and then I'm going to make you sort of talk about it, which is that one of the reviews of your work that I read about your short stories said that you had that old school New Yorker quality about your writing, and I think that they compared you to Ann Beattie and a couple other people like that. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's true. There's like a textural feeling to the way you write that's not like overburdened with contemporary information, and everything's a little bit like mood. I don't know. I'm doing a very bad job describing this for a book critic. But I'm curious what you think that quality is, and if that's something you've thought about while you write, if there are writers who you've looked at. I mean, you're a former New Yorker editor, so you obviously are like have a relationship with that idea and the magazine and the style. Although the fiction that they put out, it can be, you know, anything, but there's this sort of like mid-century New Yorker quality to your writing. Are you doing that on purpose?
Everything on purpose and not, you know, extremely intentional and beyond my control. I'm always writing at the level of the sentence, for better and for worse. So that's maybe one feature of the prose you're describing is I am just always thinking about like how to capture a particular image or sensation. And in a way, I think it's because of a sort of feedback loop that's built into writing of, the more closely you observe things, the more you're able to write about them closely, and the more you write about them closely, the more you're able to observe things closely. And it just is a way of, I think I do it because I like the type of writing that's produced, but also because I like the type of engagement with the world that sort of prose and orientation toward prose produces. Which I guess I would just describe as like attentiveness, and that's sort of what I'm always aspiring to, maybe to the exclusion of other things that I ought to also attend to. But, if we could pay attention to it all, we'd have it figured out.
Okay, so I am going to open up questions to the audience. There's a microphone over here if anyone wants to be the brave first person who stands up.
So in the part you read, there's this, I don't think it's a question that Eva's grandma is phrasing specifically, but that is sort of, she's evoking, which is what's going to happen to all these young innocent people. And I think, her rage is implying not good stuff. I'm wondering if you think of Eva and Jamie's arc through the book as like a affirmation of the rage, or a rejoinder, or maybe no relation.
That's a good question. Eva and Jamie are not rageful people, but and this is maybe the one spoiler I really won't give, but things do really there is a conflagration of really intense emotion at the end and I hadn't thought about this till you asked the question, but it does make me think that there is more of a current of anger and antagonism than they're finding productive outlets for, and that's maybe one explanation for why the story takes the shape that it does. Which I don't mean to say, it's all like doom and gloom and an unhappy ending, but that there is, maybe there's pent up rage.
More questions? Would you just mind speaking into the mic?
Okay, sure. Could you talk about the title a little bit?
Yeah, titles are my least favorite thing. I'd love to outsource titling, always. This was not the first title. I won't tell you the first title. But I think the sort of once the questions had fallen into place and sort of trying to think about the way that questioning suddenly felt really central to me in a way that it hadn't necessarily at the beginning. And one distinction that I think I've often drawn between Eva and Jamie and trying to understand them myself is, Eva is somebody who's really waiting for somebody to ask her exactly the right question. And if only they do, everything will fall into place and the story will be clear and her role in it and the world, and it's a belief that probably if she articulated she'd realize that it was a bit ridiculous. And so she probably wouldn't articulate it, but it does have all sorts of implications, I think, for how she conceives of her own interiority and agency in the world. And I think it's both sympathetic and problematic. And Jamie is somebody who's off, wanting to ask all the questions and desperately doesn't want to be asked. So I don't know, that orientation toward asking questions and being asked, I think speaks volumes about them, not necessarily volumes I fully understand, but captured something of what I was trying to understand.
I would be interested in anything you're willing to share about your method of work. Like, do you just start with the first sentence and see where it heads, or do you have a diagram or outline of the whole thing? When I read your short stories, I was impressed with the huge number of characters and situations and images, and I kind of imagined you walking around with a notebook, keeping track of all these things and figuring out where to use them, but maybe you instead, those all occur to you in the course of writing. And do you do any research?
No research. You know, the occasional Google. No, I'm impressed by all the nonfiction writers out there. Just making things up. Yeah, the method. It's one thing that I think I can say is always the case is I start and I don't know where I'm going, or I know where I'm going, but I really don't know where I'm going to end up. And I think that felt right for this book, in part because it's so much about people wanting to figure out where they're ending up and how things will end. And so it seemed like it would have been really troubling if I knew and they didn't. It would sort of have a feeling of lording some sort of knowledge over them. And I think a sort of generosity towards one character is important. So that's one thing, and kind of the method breaks down from there. But once I don't know where the end is, but I am almost always writing sequentially. And an editor I worked with once sort of pointed out that a way that my stories tend to work is by accrual, and that there is just a sense of things building naturally on each other. And, one sentence in that way leads to the next, which is, how else can you write? But I do think some people are flitting around much more and, have their note cards on the wall and they're moving things around. I'm not doing that. It does have to be a much more sort of organic, incremental process. And sometimes there's a notebook in which things are getting jotted down, but more often I think, the heuristic I'm using for what details get included or not included is, do I remember it in spite of having not written it down? So.
I read about a novelist, I won't say who takes their entire first draft and throws it out and then starts that book over again. And basically their thinking is, I'll remember it if it's that important. And that's how I know it's really good to make it into a novel. And I have never wanted to cry more reading about that process. Like, I'm not writing anything close to novel length. And the thought of somebody just being like, it's gone, start again, is absolutely terrifying. So. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can't say I'll be enacting that advice. But as we know, advice, very flawed.
No, advice.
So
great for her, not for you. Do we have more questions? I'll go around. She'll bring you the mic.
Sort of following up on the last question, when you came up with the idea for this story, did you know it needed the novel form, or were you thinking it was going to be a short story? And what are your thoughts about the two different forms of writing?
Yeah, great question. I'm a real lover of the short story, and I sort of have the belief that anything can be a short story. But I did know that I wanted the novel to cover a long period of time. And I do my best to play around with time in the short story form, and I think it's a really interesting experiment within the limits of that form, but that felt like something that I was really able to play with. It's hard in omission when you're writing in any form is a very potent tool and matters a lot. But when you're writing a short story, there just is an expectation. You're not going to be able to fit it all in. You're going to have to drop stuff out. And I think I was surprised in writing this novel, which is the only novel I've ever written, by just how much stuff you have to include and how it is much harder and much starker to make certain omissions. So that was a challenge that in some ways, I would have ideally spared myself or something. But I think it produced an interesting, it interacted interestingly with the themes of the novel in the sense that I had to be thinking really carefully about which phase of this friendship or this relationship or this romance is the is the really crucial one, and like what will happen if I just decide we're going to skip this. So yeah.
Gentleman in the back.
Hi, thank you for speaking today. I've thoroughly enjoyed what you've both had to say so far. My question has to do with the way in which you talk about the granularity with what you write, and also this vagueness, for instance, in choosing the titles. The titles are also very vague, but also balance a certain amount of precision with them as well. And something that I was very caught by whenever you were speaking just now, sorry if I missed if you had spoken about this earlier, because I came in a little bit late, but something that I was caught by was the way in which you talk about the impact that your viewpoint has had on this book. But what viewpoint are you hoping that the reader grabs from this, whether it's the balance of this precision and vagueness or something else maybe, especially whenever you were talking about the way in which you sought to develop characters in the book, for example. And there's a certain amount of precision that goes into the detail of deriving how the character develops and grows, but you're not necessarily plotting the entire way through verbatim as many authors would.
Yeah, I mean, I think one result of something I've been saying about how I don't totally know these characters, or like part of the writing is an effort to get to know them. I think a risk of that is that other people will get to know them differently, or like that's a leap of faith and also a source of great doubt that emerges upon publication of the book, where they're no longer just, figments of my imagination that I'm trying to flesh out. But that seems very fitting to me, I think, in the context of this book, that, we've mostly been talking about the two people at the center of the book, but there's lots of people in this book who are just really struggling to figure each other out. So I'm both scared of the possibility that people will, misread these characters, and I think the inevitability of those misreadings is kind of what the book is all about. So,
Great. If there's anybody else? No? Okay. So thank you guys for coming tonight. Thank you, Claire, for coming down from New York to do this. And I think Claire is going to be seated over there and signing books if people want to come line up. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much for coming.